Hey, if you're new to my channel, then consider liking and subscribing. It would really mean a lot to me, and honestly, it'd make my day. If you already did, thank you so much. Oh, and by the way, if you like listening to fan fiction, check out my other channel. The link's in the description. Oncoming Storm by Knox 1909. If you once had everything you wanted in your grasps, but then lose it all in the next second, what would you do when a demon shows up and said to you, "I will let you fix all your mistakes, but great sacrifices will be made"? Of course you'd say yes, which is exactly what Luffy had done. Follow him and someone new as he alter his life and relive as a girl? Adios.
Tale of the beginning, I will give you another chance. Its voice slithered down his ear as its blurry, shadow-like body wrapped around his own. The demon continued with its lucid voice that seemed to be dissipating through time. But great sacrifices will be made. The memory flickered. Give me your most cherished memories. Its black, bony hand reached forward. Emptiness, a voice of a woman echoed. In 9 years' time, we will meet again. He could still make out her desperate call as her silver hair flew in the unnatural wind. She was someone he had cared for. He tried to reach for her outstretched hand, but the wind, like something conscious, were pulling them apart. Sorrow, Luffy. The voices were small, almost inaudible, but he knew they were real, calling out for him in absolute distress. Why couldn't he reach to them? He felt chained with guilt of the past, feeling like a feather in the wind, being pulled along with the flow, unable to do anything. So useless, so helpless. They were all the people he loved, and now, they seemed non-existent. He couldn't even remember their name, their faces. All were taken away with the decay of time. Regret, it was all he had felt. The little girl woke up, panting, sweating, feeling like 1,000 weights were on her shoulders. The nightmares of her past had come to haunt her again last night. Luffy rubbed her eyes as if she was trying to rub the horrible images out of them and ran a hand through her messy jet black hair. She had seen more than one her age was supposed to see. Luffy climbed off the bed and landed on the ground quietly. Luffy. A raspy voice that she knew oh so well echoed from under her feet, and she could feel the beating of his foot against the rickety wooden staircase. The shout almost made her jump through the roof. Luffy paled, climbed back into the bed and, wrapping the blanket around her body like it was going to make her invisible, she stayed quiet. It was not like her to keep quiet, but the man that was coming for her was worse than a wild beast. The man was her grandfather. She could feel her blood pump as the door slammed open, and at every step of the marine hero, her heart nearly jumped out of her chest. She could hear the man cooed for her, but she ignored it. When she suddenly felt a strong hand hoist the blanket, including her, into the air, did Luffy begin to squirm and shout, "Let me go! Let me down, G-chan!" "Oh, hello to you too, Luffy!" Garp boomed happily. Luffy poked her head out through the covers and pouted at her grandfather. She didn't want to go on another marine excursion or training trip with Garp if that was what he wanted. The little 7-year-old girl wriggled out of his grip and landed on the ground with a light thud. She climbed on the bed, grabbed her hat and stood up on the mattress in order to look eye to eye with her grandfather. "Are you going to try to take me to another marine base? 'Cause I won't be going," she said as she stuck out her tongue childishly. Garp chuckled and picked her up with one hand. "So what have you been doing lately? It's been so long since I met you. 2 years was it?" He mused at how his granddaughter has grown. Luffy grinned and grabbed onto her hat. "Grandpa." He nodded in response to her call. "I've decided, I won't be another pirate on the sea." Luffy continued with a smile. This, of course, nearly made Garp go to heaven with joy, but then, the next sentence will definitely pull him down to the depths of hell. "I'll become the pirate queen instead," she cheered, pumping out her fist. "What?" He looked down. A shadow covered his face as an intimidating air surrounded him. "Do you mean you stupid granddaughter?" Then he exploded, his face red with anger. Seeing what was going to come for her if she stayed in his grip, most likely being squished to death, Luffy squirmed out of his hand and began running like her life was on the line. The small ball of excitement slid down the railing of the wooden staircase and landed on the first floor. She banged through the door and into the bar, where she faced with Makino, the barmaid, who was cleaning the tables. Even though no one ever comes to the bar anyways. The woman shot Luffy a questioning look and, like always, the girl returned it with a grin. "Got to go?" The next time you want to see me, go to the Daden family." The girl waved goodbye and slid under the bar entrance. Makino didn't even have time to register what the child just said when she heard banging echoed from the stairs. Garp jumped into the room the same way Luffy had done and demanded loudly, "Where is she?" Makino pointed to the door, finally understanding what was happening. She smiled. The cat and mouse chase between Garp and Luffy had become some kind of tradition every time they meet. Garp charged outside, nearly shattering the bar's door into splinters. Luffy had run halfway through the Fuchsia village when she pretty much charged into Mayor Whoop's slap. She bowed in apology and took off again, but something pulled the collar of her sleeping dress back. The little girl clutched her throat as she was hoisted into the air. The man asked, "Where are you going?" "Away from Ji-chan." Luffy replied like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The mayor sighed, the grip on her dress tightened. "If you're going to play cat and mouse with Garp, at least do it in normal clothes." "Who said I'm not wearing normal clothes?" Luffy stuck out her tongue and squirmed out of her sleeping dress, revealing a pair of shorts and a maroon tank top. Whoop slap sighed again. His gaze followed the girl as she ran off again, her hand on her hat. A moment later, he heaved another sigh. This one slightly longer. He couldn't help it, after all, as the towering figure of Garp darted by. The two lone figures treaded through the hectic forest. Their shouts muffled by the rustling of trees, the growls of beasts, the humming of insects. It was a dangerous forest for one to travel through, taking account to its multiple gigantic residents. The older man had short gray hair, a distinctive crescent-shaped scar around his left eyes, and was dressed in a formal black suit that doesn't, in any way, fit his characteristic. He was holding onto the little boy-like girl by her stretchy cheek. "I can't believe it," he boomed, his voice shaking the earth. "Not only did you make friend with that wretched red-haired kid, you also ate a devil's fruit." Luffy didn't really know if it was a question or a scold, but she answered it anyways. "Yeah, so?" "So?" He raised her into eye height and shouted, "You will not play with pirates when you are a marine?" "But I'm not a marine." Luffy crossed her arms and sulked. The older man lowered his hand to his side once again, but, like a child who lost his candy, still grumbled with irritation. Luffy snickered quietly. She was having a great day, despite the appearance of Garp. She was going to meet Ace, and adding it with the success in changing fate a few days ago, it was very thrilling indeed. 3 days ago, the thing with the bandits happened. Of course, she beat them up on her own this time. It was hard at first though, controlling the Gomu Gomu no Mi's powers. Still, and sadly, Higuma carried her off, that damned bandit, and took her to the sea. He was about to throw her off when the Lord of the Coast appeared and snatched the stupid bandit from the boat. The Sea King bowed to her and left. Luffy didn't know why, but after she became the Pirate King in her last life, all Sea Kings could talk to her and treated her with respect. Shanks swam in after that and asked her what happened. She spilt the truth, of course, but he told her to not tell that to anyone else or the Marine would try to kidnap her. He still gave her his hat like in the last life, and they still did their promise. "What are you grinning about?" Garp asked, snapping her out of her little flashback. She shook her head with a smile and uttered, "Nothing." Garp chuckled, "You might be better at lying than 2 years ago, but you still can't lie to me." Slightly crossed her hands and turned away with a pout. She replied, "I was thinking about how annoying Ji-chan is." She stuck out her tongue teasingly, making a few veins pop in Garp's forehead. "I might make you do another training session if you keep being stubborn like this. Now that you can't swim anymore, I might try and teach you how to fly," Garp said, a hand on his chin. Luffy cringed slightly. She did not want to know what he was thinking. The Marine Vice Admiral continued, "How about we try tying you to some balloons and see how far you can stay afloat? You must know how deadly that sounds, right, Ji-chan?" The little girl paled about 3 shades as she stated. She looked as her grandfather boomed out laughing, "It's a great idea. I might try it with Ace too." They stopped in front of the broken-down hut that Luffy knew oh so well, and Garp released her from his grip. Despite her released, Luffy climbed back onto Garp, specifically, onto his head. Her legs hung on his shoulders and her hands wrapped around his forehead. She rested her chin on his head as he slammed on the door. It was her privilege, to be able to sit on Garp. After all, he liked doting his granddaughter. The wooden door banged open. It was good that it was opened. Luffy thought that if Garp were to continue banging on it, it would shatter. A face she knew by heart was at the door, still the same thick lips that were always holding onto a cigarette, the same unkempt curly ginger hair and that same angry scowl which she had faced so much before. It was Daden, her foster mother. The woman shouted, "It's so annoying. Who's the reckless daredevil?" Garp loomed forward, letting a shadow fall on his face, making him look rather menacing. "It's me." It might not seem like so, but the words that came from his mouth could probably make some criminals cry for their mothers. In a matter of seconds, Daden's face turned from red to blue. She scrambled back, away from the doorsteps, her face painted with fear and shock. She managed to stutter, Garp-san. Luffy observed with amusement as the curtains behind Daden opened, revealing to other similar faces, Dagra and Magra. Dagra was, like always, small, his voice was weird and it makes her want to laugh, but she knew that that would be rude. Magra still had his chicken-like looks and tall stature just like she had remembered him to be. They too wore the expression Daden had on her face. Garp loosened his glare and leaned back, chuckling loudly. "Well, you seem to be doing well." Daden shouted, not feeling like welcoming Garp at all. "You've got to be kidding me. I wish you'd just leave me alone for a change." She threw her arms into the air dramatically. "Ace is already 10, you know." At the mention of Ace, Luffy couldn't even stop squirming. Garp took a hand to hold her down while laughing contentedly. "Is he? Has it been that long? How is he doing?" he said with a tinge of curiosity in his voice. Dagra whined, his face even more exasperated than it already has been. "It's no laughing matter. We could barely contain him nowadays. Just take him with you already." Magra stood in the background, nodding enthusiastically. Ignoring both of the others' whines, Garp continued nonchalantly. Anyways, he was cut off by a shout. "Don't just change the subject like that." The petite man jumped in anger. Luffy, who had gotten bored with the comedy act of the four adults, reached out her hand and began to pull on the corner of Garp's mouth. The marine hero directed his attention to the little girl on his shoulders and shot her a curious glance. She pouted adorably with her big chocolate eyes. "Where's Ace?" Garp took her off his shoulders and put her next to him, wrapping his hand around hers so she wouldn't run away. He pointed to the girl with a smile. "Take care of her too." The girl only grinned and waved at them in return. It had seemed like the two was conspiring with each other since the beginning, as the girl was so committed. Daden and Dagra couldn't even register what happened when Magra stepped in and asked, a hand scratching the back of his neck, "Who is that kid?" "She's my granddaughter." The trio was frozen for a second, then they bellowed with a voice that could probably reach the royal palace of the Goa kingdom. "What? That's a girl?" Daden said, her mouth opened so wide that fitting a buffalo inside it would be done with ease. They sat in a praying position with their knees on the ground and their heels supporting their body. The three bandits looked up to the towering marine like guilty children looking up at their scolding parents. Though their face was pale and devoid of hope, they still had a certain determination in their eyes. The trio said simultaneously, "Not happening." "Then, you'll have to make a decision." The looming figure spoke, his intimidating posture overflowing with authority. "Either you take care of her, or you can spend the rest of your life behind bars." The determination left them immediately, kind enough to not even leave a trace of its existence. The bandits' muscles tensed up and cold sweat broke on the surface of their skin. The man continued as if to torture them after alarming their misfortune. "I've turned a blind eye so far, but you committed as many crimes as there are stars in the sky." The edge of Dagra's mouth could not go any further down. If he continued frowning, no one would be surprised if his mouth broke into two pieces. "No way," he said, taking the words out of his comrade's mouth. They all felt as if they had ended up in the worst game of Would You Rather, in a literal sense, of course. Magra thought aloud, "Well, it's true we don't want to go to prison. But sometimes it actually seems tempting." Dagra finished his sentence. He continued, his voice sounded like he was walking in hell itself. "Our hands are full with just Ace. And now, you want us to take care of your grandchild too," Daden said, her voice trailing off as she imagined how her life would be like with another Ace. "You know what? She didn't even want to see a glimpse of that horrid Ness." Daden pointed to the hyperactive child, who was running across her front yard, and said with a weep, "I'm sure that kid is as much of a monster, isn't she?" "Asen, you look like a monster too." Luffy's sweet voice echoed from above, making all of the four adults glance up. She had, somehow, found her way to the roof of the hut and was lying in her belly, her head on her palms. "I'm not a man," Daden shouted. It took her a while, though, to fully understand what Luffy had just said. She jumped to her feet and retorted even more loudly, "I'm not a monster." Garp chuckled silently and waved for the girl to come down. He raised his hands in the air as if to indicate that he would catch her. Luffy stood up, wiped away the dust on her clothes and jumped onto her grandfather, nearly pushing him over. She poked her head out from under his arms, looked over his shoulders and said happily, "That was fun, let's do it again." The ginger woman fell on her head. "She's not even listening." Dagra and Magra ran to her side and tried to pull her out of the ground. Luffy watched with an amused expression. Then, suddenly remembering her urge to jump off the roof again, she scaled her grandfather like she was trying to climb a mountain. She stopped on the top of his head, a foot on his forehead as the other searched for a footing on the wall. "Don't use me as a footstool," Garp shouted, a vein appearing on his forehead. He used his hand to grab the girl and pushed her onto his shoulder as if to tell her to stay where he could, keep her under control. The girl stuck out her tongue in disapproval but stayed still anyways, letting her legs swing on his shoulder. Getting rather bored staying in one place for a while, Luffy began to take out the surviving black strands on the back of Garp's neck. His entire head was nearly turned white by now. The number of black hairs still stationed on his head could be counted in a few easy hundreds. She was cheerfully messing Y hair, making it into weird shapes and things when she felt something approaching her with her haki. Luffy dodged to a side unconsciously, allowing the tiny puddle of sticky substance meet contact with Garp's hair. She jumped off immediately and pointed to the source of the spit that was now on the Marine Vice Admiral's head, Ace. Ace was still the same as he used to be, slightly dark complexion with black hair and eyes. A pool of freckles decorated his cheeks, giving him a look not that compensated for his usual scowl. Of course, at this current moment he was not angry, he was terrified. Garo turned around, a deadly glare on his face. "Who did that?" At every word, Luffy could see Ace jolt. He wanted to run but he possibly couldn't. Luffy turned to the boy immediately, announcing, "He did it." Ace freaked. "It wasn't my fault. It was his fault for dodging it." He pointed to the younger girl, who he surely thought was a boy, and said accusingly. Knowing his unreasonable logic would not work, Ace jumped off the ox's carcass that he was sitting on and scrambled off. Garp followed closely behind the boy, shouting, "Come back here, you brat." An hour later, Ace, meet Luffy. Luffy, meet Ace. Garp said cheerily, showing the two children to each other. Ace was barely recognizable though, bruised covered his face and a bandage was wrapped around his forehead. He had suddenly found the corner of the house rather interesting and stayed quiet as he stared at it. Not even bothering to care about what anyone thinks, Garp continued, "He is 3 years older than you and from now on, you'll be living with these guys." "Okay," Luffy said immediately, nodding all the way. The bandits' jaws dropped. "You just decided that on your own?" They all screamed in unison. "I'm sure you'll all get along fine," Garp beamed as he rose to his feet. He's got other things to do other than deal with nanny bandits. "You think this is settled?" The residents of the Daden family jumped to their feet and shouted irritatingly, only to receive a death glare from Garp that nearly made them pee their pants. His voice rumbled, "What?" They immediately retreated from their mutiny, lined up and saluted him like soldiers. "We'll take care of it. Then my business here is done," Garp said as he twisted the rust doorknob. Then, he stopped midway through the door and said, "I'll visit when I have free time." Magra stepped forward and said hesitantly, "What about child support?" he said while playing with his fingers nervously. Garp thought at the top of his head for a moment then said beamingly, "Put it on my tab." Daden grumbled under her breath, "This ain't a bar, you know." It was barely audible but everyone knows how excellent Garp's hearing is, right? "Huh?" he asked threateningly, making everyone shudder in fear. Daden immediately slapped on her smile and waved at him happily. "You're always welcomed here." As soon as Garp got out of sight, she collapsed weeping. Like always, Dagra and Magra helped her to her feet and she shouted loudly in tears of anger, "Go cook something already." Luffy sat at the corner, fidgeting slightly as she watched the men scramble around the hut, cleaning, cooking, fighting. It was certainly as chaotic as she remembered it to be. A few minutes later, Daden came out of the kitchen carrying a gigantic basket of meat which was piled up like a mountain. Seeing the meat, even though badly cooked, Luffy couldn't help but drool. "Eat up," she announces, slamming the entire basket down. The moment it touched the ground, the bandits lunged forward, fighting each other for the food like wild beasts. Luffy was the first one to reach the food though. Her many years of running had helped her beat them with ease. She kicked off anyone who dared to approach her and walked off safely with a handful of meat on bones. Luffy stationed next to Daden, who was sitting by the fireplace in the middle of the room and chugged down her food, meat, rice, bone and all, like they were water. "I need more food, old man." "Oops, I meant woman," Luffy said as she pulled Daden's pants, picking out the things stuck in her teeth along the way. "I'm not old," Daden said angrily, then comprehending what the girl had just said, she retorted, "and fixing that mistake makes it even more annoying." Luffy ignored her words and continued eating. "Girl, don't you realize where you've been left?" Daden threatened, shouting into Luffy's face. "Your spit is getting onto my food," Luffy said while hugging her food protectively. She continued after looking straight into Daden's eyes, "And no, I don't realize I've been left. Probably a foul den of a bunch of fat bears, I mean bandits. Don't you know where you are?" A vein popped up on the older woman's forehead. She gritted her teeth as she loomed over the girl intimidatingly. "This is the hideout of the mountain bandits who rules Mount Corvo, the Daden family." "Mountain bandits?" Luffy narrowed her eyes. I mean you guys are annoying. But it's fine. Maybe I'll like you guys better than the others." She grinned brightly, making Daden slightly taken aback. Shut it, you bastard," Daden said, flustered by what Luffy said. "Flattery won't work. It's already a pain taking care of you. If you don't want to be here, that's fine by us. Just go out and find your own food, make your own house." Now, boss." Margaret tried to comfort Daden. "Who said I wanted to leave?" Luffy said with a smile. "I'll stay here. Getting food here is easier than in the jungle. That food you're eating is from the buffalo Ace caught. If you want to even sit at the table tomorrow, then at least catch something like Ace, or no, you can do the chores. A life of a bandit is hard. We'll work you half dead, cleaning, laundry, shoe and weapon polishing, theft, looting, swindling and killing. And listen, you're not going to say a single word to Garp about the stuff we make you do. A bowl of rice and a cup of water every day. That's all I'm giving you," she said threateningly after getting back her composure. This kid ticked her off even more than Ace had done. "I won't say anything since I won't be doing any of that stuff anyways. I'll just hunt something for you every day. And if I run out of food, I'll go get my own. So I'll stay here," Luffy said with an innocent grin. "She's fine with it." Daden slammed her head against the floor once again. "You should be crying by now." Hee hee. Luffy smiled happily, giggling at Daden's reaction. "If I can't survive this, I'll never be able to become a pirate," Luffy said proudly. She turned to Ace, noticing his glance towards her, obviously interested in what she had said. "Boss, are you okay?" The bandits panicked, asking Daden question worriedly, trying to get her up to her feet. Luffy's eyes followed Ace as he left the room and went out of the hut. "So he's going there, huh? I want to meet with Sabo soon, but if I meet up with them too early then Porkami won't be there and I won't be able to get their trust." Still, Luffy stood up, dusted off her clothes and followed Ace out of the hut. She rested a hand on her hat and gave herself an encouraging grin. "Oi, where are you going?" Daden shouted. She had just gotten up to her feet. Then she realized what Luffy just said and shouted, "And did you just say pirate?" Luffy, ignoring the bandits, followed Ace outside. Daden jumped up and shouted even louder the time around, cursing, "Damn it. She's not listening, you see? She's way too stubborn. This is why I don't want Garp's grandchild." Magra, with another attempt to calm down his boss, said, "Now calm down, boss." Luffy had already left the hut, ignoring the conversation of the bandits. She ran after her brother deeper into the jungle and said with a happy grin, "Let's talk. I'm sure you already know my name. Let's try to get a little bit closer, Ace." Ace turned around, the dangerous and distant look still in his eyes. He glared down at Luffy, who was still approaching him. Luffy shouted, "Stay there, I'm coming." Ace observed her for a moment, turned around and kicking it in half. Then with another kick, he rolled the tree downhill. Luffy, knowing it would happen, jumped on top of the rolling trunk, dodging it and used it as a platform to reach Ace. Bouncing off the trunk, she landed with a thud next to where Ace was standing. She turned to her brother, a hand holding onto her straw hat. "I told you to stay still, didn't I?" Only to be replied with a click of his tongue, and Ace ran off with amazing speed. Luffy shouted as she followed, "Wait, I know the direction you're heading to. It's the Grey Terminal, isn't it?" The young boy had already crossed the bridge halfway when he suddenly halted, surprised at what Luffy had said. But then he erased the look off his face and turned to the girl who stood at the beginning of the bridge. Luffy approached Ace slowly and said with a smile, "Wondered how I knew that, did ya?" Ace began approaching her, slowly, with his grip tightening on the silver pipe. The two exchanged a determined look before Ace swung the pipe and threw Luffy over the bridge. Luffy didn't scream. She was not even scared because she knew it was coming. After seeing Ace left, she used the Gomu Gomu no Fuzen to land safely on the ground. She thought to herself, "I'll be staying in this forest for a week, so I should play around a little. Let's go on an adventure, then." 1 week later, Boss Dagra called out, his face drowned in confusion. "Boss Daden." Magra, appearing from behind the door, inquired, "Who is?" He stopped in mid-sentence, his eyes nearly popping out. "Who's there?" Daden said, only to see who it is and get imprinted with an expression of surprise. "It's you." She pointed at the shadow of Luffy. "She came back," Dagra said, his jaws nearly fallen off. Luffy approached them with a makeshift trolley full of gigantic dead animals' carcasses. She looked fine even though her clothes were torn and her skin was full of scratches. She spoke, "This is food for the next 7 days. They're fresh. I just hunted them." Then Luffy handed them the trolley and entered the house, leaving the three of them speechless. She said her last word as she went into her and Ace's room. "I'm tired. Don't disturb me. Good night." She slammed the door shut behind her, collapsed to the ground and fell asleep immediately. Daden looked at the trolley, and then turned to where Luffy was. Where was that kid? What was she doing? "I wonder that too," Dagra and Magra said together. Daden turned to the two, threw the trolley of meat at them, then shouted, "Get that stocked, it's food for the next week." Day 8, Ace. "Wait for me," Luffy shouted as she followed the young boy's figure into the forest. "Boss, she's going after Ace again," Dagra shouted, warning Daden. She poked her head through the door and grumbled, "And she just returned yesterday." Magra appeared from behind the two. Luffy left a note. He handed Daden the paper. The bandit's boss read the note aloud. "Gone to the jungle with Ace. I'll return with food. Don't worry about me, okay?" Winking smiley face. Daden exploded, "We're not worried." Luffy, who was halfway down the hill, turned around and stuck out her tongue naughtily. She purposely chose a place where she was in sight of all the bandits to annoy them. "That little brat," Daden shouted angrily. Now, boss." Magra tried to calm the woman down. He turned towards where Luffy was to see she had already left. "Ace, wait for me." Calling out to her older brother, Luffy once again followed Ace into the jungle. Running faster and faster, deeper and deeper into the forest, Ace suddenly halted in front of a river. Hovering over it was a branch that carried long green vines, and in the river, there were floating logs like alligators. Taking off and grabbing onto a vine, Ace swung over to the other side of the river where a rock cliff was located. He jumped on the rocks and used them like stairs to get to the top. Then he took off running deeper into the woods. Luffy waited until he was out of sight, grabbed onto the branch and rocketed herself onto the top of the cliff. She held onto her hat and gave a satisfying smile. "It seems Ace didn't know I survived that." She scratched the back of her head, shrugging. She continued whispering to herself, "Better get Daden something to eat then." Day 10, boss, one of the bandits called out lazily. He indicated to the disappearing figure of the girl. "Luffy, get back and work," Daden shouted as she peeked out of the door. "I'll give you something in my treasure tab," Luffy shouted happily while her legs still followed Ace. They once again ran deeper into the forest. Ace leading with his silver pipe in his hand. Luffy behind with her excited grin. Ace stopped slightly before hopping onto the rocks and landing on top of a tall cliff. Luffy smiled and followed confidently. "You're not the only one who could do that." Suddenly, a hail of rocks fell from the cliff and head for Luffy. "That's cruel," Luffy thought before using her observation haki to dodge all the rocks and landed on the cliff. She scratched her head. "He's already gone. I want to talk to him." 1 month later, Luffy, Daden shouted, it had always been the first thing she did in the morning nowadays. She left long ago, Dogra said with a bored voice. Did she tell you she'd get us food? Daden asked. Her voice now less angry. Dogra turned to her and said after a slight pause, yes. She didn't, right? Daden smashed his head angrily, biting on her cigarette, go get her. Right, Dogra ran off while grabbing onto his wound. Luffy continued to follow Ace into the dangerous forest. Sometimes she'd get attacked by a gigantic cobra. Sometimes she'd fall down one of the cliffs and sometimes she'd be pushed into the valley, but she never stopped. On rainy days, on windy days, she'd still run after Ace. 2 months later, she'd gone and run after Ace's butt again. Daden shouted as she chewed on the white stick. She was staring at the door like expecting something to smash through it the next moment, particularly a young girl. I can't believe she hasn't learned yet, after all the trouble she's been through. Dogra sighed. Even though he doesn't want to admit it, he worries for the little girl. I wish she wouldn't make me worry so much, Daden shouted, dropping her cigarette to the ground. Of course, she wanted to take the words right after they came out. Hee hee, you're worried? Dogra asked deviously. Of course not, Daden denied, but gave it away with her flustered cheeks that were turning into a warm shade of red. Don't be ridiculous, she suddenly screamed. Luffy had returned from another day with Ace. Today, she earned a few badly swollen wasp bites, alligator's teeth wound, and she was soaking wet. The girl was barely recognizable. She turned to the three and said with a straight face, I hit a wasp hive and jumped into the water to get rid of them, but I couldn't swim, so I had to grab onto an alligator to stay afloat. I'll go to sleep now, save me some food. Luffy, the three said with terrified faces. Month number 2, week 2. Ace, wait for me. Luffy still followed Ace, screaming with useless effort. They had once again ended up in a non-ending cat and mouse chase. Still, like any other day, it was the mouse chasing the cat. Ace had already stationed himself on top of the cliff, looking down at Luffy. He groused under his breath. This is not a mistake. Ace had mistaken Luffy for a boy. Yes, followed me all the way here. What a persistent guy. Suddenly, a shadow appeared from the bushes, rustling the leaves around it. It was huge, about 20 times the size of a normal human, grumbling and growling with its earth-shaking voice. I lost Ace, Luffy whined, swaying her limbs in the air like an annoyed baby. Then she turned to the Tiger Lord, and gave it a smile. Ace grunted, his nose wriggling. He thought, that's the Lord of the Jungle. That kid doesn't stand a chance. Why isn't he moving? Is he too scared? I won't die today, Luffy said with a confident grin. Ace was surprised by the look on her face, the words she said, and most of all, he admired her confidence. Ace stood up, preparing to jump down before the Tiger Lord could charge at Luffy, but then a gigantic bear appeared. The two wild animals fought each other off, disappearing into the woods. Luffy turned up to smile at the sky before running back into the jungle, leaving Ace to sigh with relief. He had suddenly felt a liking to the boy, girl. 3 months later, Luffy sighed happily, I'm here. The Great Terminal, she raised her hands into the air victoriously. After 3 rigorous months, she had finally reached her destination. She smiled as the thick white fog cleared, revealing the uncountable mountains of trash that piled up to unbelievable heights. Welcome to the Great Terminal. The blinding light landed on the young girl's face as she began to slowly emerge from the trees and bushes. The gray fog cleared and revealed mountains and mountains of thrown-away garbage, the trash that the nobles on the other side of the gigantic wall do not need, in which it also included humans. From pieces of broken machineries to toys thrown away by children, it was all there, hidden from sight of the cleaner people. Luffy wrinkled her nose. Of course, not because of the smell or the crawling sick and injured people, not because of the dirtiness or anything like that. She felt disgusted because this was the most obvious proof to how rotten the people in the intersections are. Luffy hated those kinds of people. I'm about to meet Sabo. I can't show a face like this, Luffy said as she wiped away her annoyed and hateful look and slapped on her typical clumsy grin, the grin that only seemed to fit her face. Sliding down the trash hill she was standing on, Luffy landed with a light thud and started looking around, asking herself, now, how did I find Ace and Sabo again? Climbing on the body of a broken crane. Luffy began skimming the area. Then, remembering something, she pointed to a tall tree which was poking out from the treetops in the forest in between Mount Corvo and the terminal. They're there. Seeing Ace's figure also heading in the direction, Luffy jumped off and grabbed a long iron pipe along the way. Then she took off and followed Ace into the jungle. The young boy stopped in front of the tree and looked up, calling out to Sabo. Luffy had decided to hide behind one of the trees nearby to look for an appropriate time to appear. "Oh, Ace," Sabo replied, hiding under the leaves of the branch. Luffy, for the first time in 3 months, Ace smiled. "Sorry I'm late." "You sure are." Sabo leaned forward, looking down towards Ace. He wore a top hat that sat neatly on top of his curly blonde hair. Whenever the young boy talked, it would reveal his missing tooth. Seeing her older brother still the same, wearing his blue tailcoat and owning his fluffy smile, Luffy couldn't help grinning madly. Sabo continued, "I've already done some work in the city." "Really? Truth is, I have too," Ace said, and the two young boys grinned at each other deviously. Sabo supported Ace onto the branch and they began to compare each other's loot. "Here we go," they showed their treasure. Sabo gaped at Ace's treasure bag. "Amazing. You got more than me." Ace grinned proudly. Sabo observed the bag more closely. "This is a lot of treasure. How'd you get it?" "I stole it from some hoodlums near the main gate." "Damn, you beat me again today," Sabo said, slightly upset but still happy, as he began counting through the money. "It doesn't matter who wins, does it? We're gonna spend the pirate fund together one day anyways." "It must have been 5 years since we've started saving, huh?" Ace looked down at the treasure hidden in the hole in the branch. "We've worked hard." Ace smiled at Sabo. The blonde boy smiled back. "We sure have. To leave East Blue and head into a world these islanders don't even know about," Sabo said as he turned to the breathtaking scene of the sea. He smiled. "I get excited just thinking about it." Ace followed his gaze and gave an excited smirk. The sea, to them, was like a road to freedom. A way to get away from the dark world that only they could see. "Hurry and close the lid, we don't know who might be looking," Ace warned Sabo, snapping the boy out of his thoughts. Sabo stuffed the last load of money into the hole and asked, "I wonder how much money we would need to buy a pirate ship." "Who know, hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions," Ace answered, still looking at the deep, blue sea that stretched towards the skyline. He then turned to his brother. "Whatever it is, we've still got a long way to go." Luffy smiled, walked out from the shadow of tree and decided that it's time she make her appearance. "A pirate ship?" she said aloud excitedly. Sabo, startled, snapped the lid shut and turned to look at the source of the voice. Luffy waved her hand at Sabo. "You guys want to be pirates? So will I." Luffy laughed aloud innocently. She had worn a black tank top that had a pirate Jolly Roger on it and wore a pair of maroon pants. She looked extremely similar to a boy, which had caused both Ace and Sabo to mistake her for one. Ace and Sabo were shocked and scared to near death, their face losing its color. The two brothers turned to Luffy, then each other. They nodded in unison and began climbing down the trunk of the tree. They landed in front of Luffy in a matter of seconds, and with their fist, they knocked Luffy to the ground. "Be quiet." Luffy landed on the ground with her butt and while rubbing her head said, "That's a rude way to greet someone." The two grabbed onto Luffy's arms before she could react. "So this is where you go every day, Ace," Luffy said, as carefree as ever even though she was secured to the tree and was unable to move. "Shut up," Ace intercepted the young girl, who he thinks is a boy. "So this is the Luffy guy you've been talking about?" Sabo asked as he crossed his arms. The two brothers were both armed with pipes and gave off an intimidating air. "So Ace talked about me, tailcoat boy?" Luffy asked excitedly. "It's Sabo," the blonde boy fixed. "Right," Luffy answered with a nod. Ace rested his hands on his hips and spoke in an annoyed voice, cutting the conversation between the two. "Yeah, I've been complaining about how clingy you are. And how you never think about what you're doing." Sabo finished the sentence. The young girl only laughed happily and said with a smile, "I see. You don't know much about me then. How about we get to know each other a little more?" Sabo sighed and glared down at Luffy with confusing eyes, wondering if this kid has a few screws loose or not. Doesn't he realize that we're insulting him? He finally made it all the way here. Ace turned to Sabo and said, "And I made sure to use the paths that ordinary people can travel. The two troublemakers looked at each other with wary stares as cold sweat dripped down their foreheads. "Hey, Sabo, Ace, you two seem like close friends." Luffy interrupted with a naive grin. Sabo opened his mouth, then closed it, then said, "How did you know my name?" "You said it early," Luffy said, looking above like she was trying to regain something on the top of her mind. Sabo clicked his tongue before rubbing his chin. "I didn't mean to say it so soon. I just ended up doing it unconsciously because he called me Tailcoat Boy," he mumbled under his breath. "Hey, Sabo, be my friend too?" Luffy asked, straightforwardly with a smile. "Wait, what do you mean, too?" Ace asked as he poked his pipe at Luffy's nose. The young girl grinned clumsily and replied, "Aren't we already friends?" she asked Ace. "We're not," Ace shouted angrily. The two brothers gave a tisk and turned to each other with annoyed looks. Sabo spoke, "This is why I said you should just live here. Taking that round trip and training in the mountains each day just caused us a lot of trouble. What are we gonna do? Now that he knows our secret, I'm sure he'll tell everyone if we let him go." Ace mumbled, his eyes full of malice, "Let's kill him." "Right, let's do that." Sabo nodded after a moment of thought. Luffy dropped her grin and paled. She knew they weren't going to do anything to her, but the looks in their eyes are creepy enough to send a bull running. She calmed herself down and said with a serious voice, "I won't tell anyone, I swear, so don't kill me. If you try, I'll scream." "HMPH. We're not going to believe you," Ace said, though he wanted to believe the girl. The black-haired boy turned to Sabo, "You do it, hurry." "Why'd I have to?" Sabo freaked out, "You do it." "I can't, I've never killed someone before," Ace shouted. Somehow, the two had gotten caught up in an argument. Sabo returned the shout, "Neither have I. I don't know how to kill someone." "Haven't you heard what I said?" Luffy said, Tisable smirk on her lips, "I'm gonna scream." She took in a deep breath and before the two could react, she let out an ear-deafening scream. "Help me, murderers, someone help me." The shout echoed through the jungle. It was so loud, it could possibly be heard on the other side of Mount Corvo. Ace and Sabo were now freaking out and had ended in a state of absolute panic. They grabbed at Luffy's mouth and shouted in unison, "Shut up." Somewhere out on the edge of the jungle next to He Terminal where the children were unaware of, Porkamy, a large-built man with a shark-like face and long purple hair, stood with his subordinates. One of the followers shouted, "There, in the jungle. I just heard a child's voice." He pointed and the four then entered the forest. Hearing the footsteps from the distance, the two brothers stopped messing with Luffy and grumbled, "Oh no, someone's coming. For starters, let's untie him. If we don't get out of sight, they'll find the treasure," Ace suggested. And so the two did. They untied Luffy and the three of them climbed behind a few bushes. They stayed there, sitting quietly as Porkamy and his men approached the tree. Overhearing Porkamy's conversation about Blue Jam, Ace silently cursed under his breath for stealing those men's loot. He had thought they were just some hoodlums like all the others. "You got that money from those guys?" Sabo asked worriedly. Ace gritted his teeth. "We've got some dangerous money in our hands. The guy who is carrying the sword is Blue Jam's underling, Porkamy. He's absolutely crazy. Have you heard?" Sabo informed, his face tensing. "He tears the skin off the face of the people he defeats, while they're still alive." "I don't like that guy," Luffy grumbled. Remembering what he did to Ace, Luffy couldn't help but feel like punching him across the face. Thinking of something, Luffy began to move. "We can't let ourselves be seen." The two brothers dug deeper into the bushes. Sabo turned to Luffy, making sure she was there but not even a soul was next to him. He turned to look at where Porkamy was and almost screamed. Luffy, holding one of the two's pipe, just swung and hit the stick at Porkamy. The iron surface hit against his temple making him tumble back a few steps. "What the hell is he doing?" The two brothers shouted in their minds. Luffy, who had just pissed the man off, ran towards the gray terminal while shouting, "Oi, Sharkface. I know where Ace is. If you want to know, try and catch me." Luffy shouted and stuck out her tongue while stretching her cheeks. Porkamy stood up and he and his men began chasing Luffy. "What is that idiot doing?" Ace shouted, getting ready to chase after her. He didn't know why but he didn't want to leave the boy alone. But, a hand reached out to stop him. Sabo said with a determined look, "We should move the treasure while Porkamy is distracted." And, That kid is no idiot. He just saved us from losing our treasure. You mean he teased Porkami on purpose? Ace asked, slightly confused, wondering who would do that for someone they don't know. We shouldn't waste his effort. Let's move the treasure to somewhere safer. After getting caught and tortured, that kid would somehow tell the truth anyway, Sabo said as he began climbing up the tree. The hut was very terribly built and looked as if it was about to fall apart. Luffy was tied to a column that supported the small house. The small rays of light managed to sneak in through the dozen of holes on the wall and ceiling and land on the girl's face. Porkami stood opposite to her, a gigantic hammer in his hand. I won't tell you anything, Luffy said, her eyes full of determination. Porkami approached the girl slowly, dragging the hammer with him. He had an eerie air around him that could send shudders down one's spine. He raised the hammer into the air and smashed it down with immense force. The hammer hit the floor, sending splinters in every direction. It stayed there for a second, seemingly crushing the child, only for it to bounce right back up the next moment. I told you that you can't hurt me like that, Luffy said with a defiant grin. The men in the back, who were watching Porkami torture Luffy, began panicking only to be told to shut up by Porkami. The tall man walked closer. So you have the devil fruit's powers, don't you? I don't know which fruit, but if this kind of attack won't hurt you, there are other types of torture. Bring me my gloves, Porkami ordered. The pirates began to tie Luffy and hung him from the ceiling. One of the men returned with a pair of spiked gloves. Porkami snapped them on and approached the young girl. Listen up, brat. The cash that your friend, Ace, stole was our pirate's crew's precious treasure. And you know where it is, so just tell me. No way. Luffy protested. But before she could continue, the spiked fist slammed against her face, splattering blood to the ground. Luffy spat out blood and spoke. Watch the face. A girl needs to keep her face pretty, you know, she said with a grin. Shut up, brat. The only thing you need to say is where the treasure is, Porkami demanded. Never, she said with the same determined eyes. Another punch sent her flying. More blood dripped to the ground, but she refused to let out even a cry. It was painful, excruciatingly painful even, but she refused to speak or even let a tear drop. If only she could control her haki properly right now, she'd beat them easily. Her control over observation haki was still superb, but she had no control over armament and conqueror's haki. They were out of control. IW won't talk, Luffy mumbled. She managed to activate her conqueror's haki for a moment, but only one of the followers fell. The two asked him what happened, but he was already unconscious, foaming from his mouth. Porkami didn't react, he only continued punching Luffy. Go search for Ace and Sabo. Now, he ordered, and the two conscious underlings ran off with their tails between their legs. The two brothers had finally finished moving their treasure to another tree in the forest. They hid it under the roots of an old oak. Sabo was going to head to the Great Terminal to check about any new revolving around Porkami when Ace stopped him and asked, Something feels wrong here, doesn't it? What do you mean? Sabo asked. Ace turned to him. It's been hours and none of their men had come here to find us. Ace felt that something was wrong, seeing the determined look in Luffy's eyes and how he'd face off the two lords of the jungle the other day. Ace knew that it was not so simple. Something about that kid told him that Luffy wouldn't just tell them the location of their treasure. Do you mean? Sabo looked at Ace after a while of thought. Ace nodded. Both their faces drowned with fear and worry. He hasn't told them yet. The two other men, who had returned from their useless hunt, were now on the ground with foam coming out of their mouth. Porkami was continuously punching Luffy across the face as Luffy coughed up blood. She couldn't even move anymore. After using the Conqueror's haki on the two other hoodlums, Porkami was furious and began to ask her what she did. Luffy didn't have a chance to knock him out since she was losing her consciousness. Her vision blurred. The only thing she could make out was the figure of Porkami pick up the sword and telling her she no longer have a using and he will kill her now. Luffy could retort, she could even scream. She thought she had lost all hope. Suddenly, the wooden wall burst open and the two boys, Ace and Sabo, charged in. Luffy looked up, her vision getting slightly better. She couldn't even feel the pain anymore. Her senses have dulled. Panting and breathing unevenly, she croaked, Ace, Sabo. She felt like she could cry. Her brothers were there, protecting her again. Ignoring the underlings laying on the ground, Ace charged straight towards Porkami, jumping up, getting ready to smash down on his head. The pirate, effortlessly, grabbed Ace in midair by the neck and said with a smirk, "You brats showing up makes it much your friend has such sealed lips." Ace struggled in his grip. All he managed to do was croak out Sabo's name. Sabo jumped up and charged from behind, swinging his pipe. He hit Porkamy across the head. The large man dropped Ace and stumbled slightly. He growled like a wild beast and regained his footing. "That hurt pretty bad, you know." XXXXX Luffy was sleepy now. She was sure that after the sleep she would feel much better. Her eyes won't be blurry. Her ears won't be ringing. She didn't feel this terrible when this happened in the last life. Maybe it was because using hockey had exhausted her too much. She couldn't even comprehend what was going on. Luffy then dozed off into a deep sleep. XXXXX Porkamy turned around, the blade in his hand glistening. "You know what happens when you make fun of grown-ups, don't you?" he said with a mad grin. "Your opponent is right here." Ace stood up to his feet and shouted, getting Porkamy's attention, "Sabo! Get Luffy!" Sabo could do nothing but nod. He was scared. He didn't want to admit it, but he was. Running past Ace, he could see his brethren's leg shaking slightly. "I guess Ace is scared too," he thought, couldn't help the smile. Sabo picked up the knife one of the fallen pirates were holding and went off to cut Luffy's rope. Porkamy's and Ace's fight had begun. Ace continuously dodged and returned the hit while Porkamy take the initiative. It seemed as if Ace could fend off the man well enough. Sabo, at the while, had been able to free Luffy. He grabbed the child around the waist and carried him under his arm. "Ace, I got Luffy, let's go." "You go on ahead," Ace announced, steady on his feet, ready for another round with Porkamy. Sabo tensed. He wanted to mishear what Ace had said. "Why does that idiot have to stay stubborn at the most annoying times?" he shouted, scolding Ace. "You idiot, come on. Once I've chosen an opponent, I won't run," Ace announced stubbornly. "What? You brat," Porkamy shouted angrily, the wound on his head bleeding. Sabo turned around with a worried look. "Don't, he's on a different level compared to those delinquents in town." "Don't you get it?" Porkamy asked with a dark look. "Oi, playtime's over. You stole our money. You will obediently return it to us. You insolent brat. I'm sure you've realized you've done a bad thing. I won't hurt you if you give back the money," he said, his grin widening as he pointed the blade at Ace. The young boy smashed the sword away and said with a glare, "We're gonna make much better use of it." Porkamy grunted, now as twice as annoyed. He straightened up and glanced down at the child. "What did you say?" Dropping Luffy gently to the ground, Sabo said as he approached his comrade, "You, wait just a minute." He ran up next to Ace. "You're being too reckless. Why are you always doing this?" "I never back down." The determined look still at his eyes, sparkling like a flame that would never be diminished. "Don't be ridiculous," Porkamy shouted as he swung his sword. Ace jumped up to parry it, but before he could react, the pipe was cut clean in half. A lunatic grin etched across his face as Porkamy announced proudly, "If I lose to a pair of kids, I'll quit being a pirate." "Then we'll make you quit." The two boys leapt up and attacked the pirate with all their might. Porkamy shouted back, "I'll slaughter ya." The voices echoed through the terminal as the weapons clashed. "Is he alright?" Ace asked as they leaned closer to the unconscious boy, girl. Sabo had just finished bandaging up the wounds on her face when she opened her eyes with a snap. Luffy sat up, her eyes wide, then tears started to fall out. Seeing the reaction, Sabo freaked out while Ace turned his worry into anger. He shouted, "Why are you crying? The fighting's over, you're rescued. Why are you crying?" Luffy raised a hand to her eyes and started wiping the tears away, but they won't stop coming out. She muttered, "I don't know." "Ace, stop shouting at the kid. He just had a mental trauma." Ace put a hand on Ace's shoulder. Somehow, both of them had become worried for the kid. Ace clicked his tongue and continued fixing up his pipe with sticky tape. Luffy had started sobbing, and now both Ace and Sabo no longer mind to worry about it. She sat there, tears down her cheek, crying. Even if she had the memory of her old life, she was still a 7-year-old child. Sabo turned to Ace. "That's a really bad habit you've got there." "Ace," Sabo relaxed himself, leaning on the root of the tree while crossing his arms, refusing to run when you're against real pirates. "Why are you so eager to die?" Ace ignored Sabo's scolding and continued to observe his staff. This doesn't feel quite right, it was better before. Sabo shook his head and sighed, feeling like he's the only one who was thinking straight. After this, Blue Jam's crew will never forgive us. They'll be after us from now. Then he turned to Luffy, who was crying into her palms. She didn't make a noise, sometimes hiccuping. Ace jumped down from where he sat. It's so annoying. Stop sobbing. If you're going to cry, just cry properly. Stop trying to stay quiet. I hate cry babies like you. You're like a girl. Luffy wiped away her tears for the last time and stopped crying abruptly. Her head shot up and she said with a pout, I'm a child. I was just tortured and someone tried to kill me. Let me cry. Ace and Sabo gaped at the supposed to be a girl boy and was shocked at how she immediately stopped crying. She continued arguing, I was trying to stay quiet so I won't bother you. She sighed, calmed herself down, jumped off the root she was sitting on and stood in front of the two. Thank you for saving me, she bowed. Why you? Ace shouted, but he was stopped by Sabo. Ace had never been thanked before. He didn't know how to reply to gratitude. The only feeling he could put in was anger. Luffy straightened up, revealing the tears that were about to flow out again, but she didn't let them go because she knows crying will not help. Ace charged forward like an angry dog. Why didn't you tell them? Those people would kill people without a second thought. The young girl bowed down, her hat covering her face. If I told them, she said as she begins to look up, a smile suddenly appearing on her face, I will never be able to get your trust. Why do you even need our trust? You could have died, Ace shouted. I need your trust so we could be friends. I'd rather die than be alone, Luffy said, tears oozing into her eyes but none had fallen. After all the thing I put you through? You'd still want to be my friend? Ace pointed at Luffy accusingly. There's nobody else, Luffy said, tears rolling down her cheeks. Grandpa's gone. I can't return to Fushia village. The bandits won't play with me, there's only you. Then, Ace said, his glare softening, it isn't so bad that I am here? Luffy nodded enthusiastically. He agreed. And it'd be bad if I wasn't here. He continued. Luffy nodded again. Thinking of the people who wanted him dead, calling him a monster and a demon. Ace tightened his grip on the pipe and bit his underlip. So, you want me to live? Ace asked, looking down so that his bangs would shadow his eyes. Luffy nodded happily and said, of course. Ace turned around, hiding his smiling face and said, but I don't like girly and weak kids like you. Luffy wriggled her nose and shouted as she charged at Ace. Who said I was weak? Luffy leapt into the air and grabbed onto Ace's back, making him fall over. Ace was unaware of this, but he was slightly blushing. Luffy lay on top of Ace's chest, looking at him straight to the face, and with a mischievous, she said, I'll become the strongest in the group and beat all of you. Ace knocked his forehead against hers, making her fall aside and off his chest. After he stood up, he shouted, still slightly flustered, who said that? I'll become a pirate captain and beat both of you. Luffy jumped up to her feet and pressed against Ace's forehead with her own and announced, I'll become a great pyramized shanks and you won't do anything about it. You, a pirate? Ace said, leaning harder against her. The two continued fighting before Sabo interrupted. Okay, that's enough. Oh, by the way, I've got a problem. A problem? Luffy asked, faking innocence. Yeah. Sabo continued, because of what happened today, Blue Jam's crew will be trying to find and kill all three of us, right? Yeah, I guess. Ace agreed. Sabo continued, I've been living in the forest, but it's close to their base, the Pirates' Cove. What do you think would happen if I fell asleep somewhere and they attacked me? You'd die. Ace said bluntly. Luffy joined in and nodded, you'd definitely die. Indeed. Sabo said and looked at the two, so, I've got a favor to ask you. You guys, hear me out. The three grouped together and started discussing enthusiastically. The next morning, true chaos arrived at the Daden's family hideout. It was the appearance of the three little monsters. A few weeks has passed since Sabo had settled down in the Daden's family hideout. Even though it was pretty much no better than the Great Terminal, the blonde boy liked it here, spending time with his friend and free to do whatever he wants. Turns out, Daden wasn't as terrible as most people make her out to be, still ugly though. And by most people he meant Ace and Luffy. Though there was something that had begun to bug him starting about 2 days ago when Sabo's little discovery today, He and Ace had returned late after they checked up on their pirate fund when they were hit by a sudden downpour. The storm roared outside and a lightning cracked through the air. The two brothers charged into the hut with their pipes and were drenched with rainwater. Daden was furious, more like worried to Dagra. She had waited all night for the two troublemakers and they returned home with drenched clothes and a continuous sneezing competition. "We are fine," Ace grumbled as he twisted his shirt to squeeze out all the water. Sabo, who stood next to him, nodded enthusiastically in agreement. They carried their pipes into the house while waving dismissively, "We'll go to bath so don't disturb us." Daden grunted at the ungrateful brats and started to rant about haunting Garp for the rest of his life when she was disturbed by her accomplice, Dagra. "I thought Luffy was already in the bath?" "She is," Daden said, her face paled. "Yeah, she just returned from her hunt and decided she should take a bath." Magra appeared from behind Dagra. Before they could continue, Daden had already fainted on the ground with her face as white as paper. If Garp knows that Sabo or Ace saw her naked in the bath, she could bid farewell to her life as a bandit or as a human. Luffy was about to dip herself in the steaming hot bath after thoroughly scrubbing herself. It was a harsh day. She hadn't been able to see her two beloved brothers at all since they had business to attend to at the terminal. She ended up having to hunt alone today, and more than anything, being alone is tiring. She sighed as she climbed up the stool in order to reach the top of the tub. She stood on her toes while reaching out to check the water. Luffy didn't know why, but since she became a girl, she had cared much more about baths. Then suddenly, the sound of the loud approaching footsteps startled her. She slipped off the chair and landed on the floor with a loud thud, her towel falling off. It was Ace and Sabo. She could hear them discussing about their thieving at the grade terminal. Struggling to pull her body steady onto her feet, Luffy grumbled at the slippery floor. She stood up and rubbed the sore bump where her back had hit the floor. Sabo, hearing the noise that came from the room, was curious. Ace had started to take off his clothes while happily discussing about how much money they have gathered. Sabo, with his interest still piqued, opened the door to the bath and peeked in. To his surprise, Luffy was there, stark naked, the hot steam that lingered in the air enveloping her. Sabo stared at her. Luffy stared back, water dripping down from her wet raven locks. At the sight, Sabo had frozen. A wave of warm blood rushed to his cheeks as he felt them get warmer. "Sorry," Sabo squeaked as he quickly slammed the door shut and turned around with his face deeply blushed. He slid down with his back against the door, his knees to his face, trying to contain his embarrassment. It was the first time he saw a girl naked, and that girl had turned out to be his newest friend. What if she hates him for it? He put his hands to his face and silently wept inside his mind. "Sabo, what is it? You're acting weird." Ace came over, his voice annoyed but slightly worried. His brother was acting weird, and that was not something he's happy about. Sabo was ignoring him. "Ace, let's bath later," Sabo said as he looked up to Ace with blank eyes that said something bad would happen if Ace didn't listen. He couldn't believe how thick he was to not realize this. 2 weeks, and he didn't notice a thing. This was probably because Luffy didn't really know anything about gender differences. "Why?" Ace said questioningly, his head tilted to a side. "Don't ever come in the bath while Luffy is bathing." "Okay," Sabo said as he looked up to Ace. Now he had realized why Daden never let the three of them bath together. Ace shot him a questioning look before tumbling off to put his clothes on while Sabo tried calming his blush. They left the bathroom awkwardly, and from that day, the blonde boy was never able to see his brother the same way anymore. That night, Sabo switched place with Ace so he wouldn't end up sleeping next to Luffy because he knew he'd end up with a sleepless night if he did. A few days later, Gomu Gomu no, pistol. The fist sped back after stretching out of sight. Luffy kept her footing as she aimed the rubber arm at her soon-to-be brother. Ace glowered at the fist and dodged aside, missing it by a millimeter. The punch scraped him slightly but was not harmful. Ace spun around and swung his pipe at the young girl with all his might. Luffy, while suppressing herself from using any form of haki, ducked down frantically and shouted, "Gomu Gomu no Muchi, whip." The leg swept its way through the plane and Ace jumped up. Unfortunately, he was too slow and his feet got caught by the stretching limb. He lost his balance and fell face first to the ground, resulting to a large nosebleed. 1 point. Sabo said as he turned around to write on the scoreboard. Ace grumbled as he pushed himself up. He was annoyed, but he accepted his defeat. Of course, he won't say it aloud though. If he did, he knows he wouldn't be able to resist punching Luffy's defiant face. Sabo squatted down next to Ace and tried to suppress his nosebleed. "You're fighting me next, Ace, get ready. I won't take it easy," Sabo said with a devious grin. Ace nodded as if accepting the challenge. Suddenly springing into action, the two clashed their weapons and began to parry each other's blows as if they were testing one another. Pouncing backwards to gain distance, they stood there, panting while observing the other, guessing their next move. Like in sync, the boys jumped into the air and charged at each other. Sabo took the initiative and threw a punch. Ace, deducting his move, dodged to a side and with a smile, he announced, "It's my win today." He sent a kick straight to Sabo's gut and they landed on the ground. Sabo lay on his back and moaned painfully while Ace landed with a victorious smile. "Cool." Luffy ran towards the two, a stupid grin on her face. She grabbed Sabo's arm and pulled him to his feet before shouting excitedly, Sabo, fight me." "Sure." Sabo stood up and got into fighting position. "This is the last fight before we calculate the score, so let's make it a good one, okay?" Sabo announced. He had gotten more relaxed about the entire being a girl problem. Luffy was still Luffy and that was great. She didn't even mean to hide her gender. It was the two of them mistaking it on their own. Sabo smiled as he charged at the young girl with all his might with a battle cry, but Luffy didn't move. Sabo thought for a moment when he finally realized the girl had something up her sleeves. But it was too late to back down now. He sent his kick into the air. Gomu Gomu no, Flytrap. She reached for her fingers and stretched them out. His leg was caught between them and he was unable to pull back. Luffy twisted her arms and wrapped the fingers around Sabo's calf. With all her might, she swung him into the air, releasing her fingers as she slammed him down to the ground. After spinning one round in the air, Sabo landed face first onto the earth. Oomph, he let out. Sabo turned around on the earth and let out a laugh. A new move, huh? I let my guard down cause I thought I knew all your trick, Lou. Oh, and what a mistake that was, Luffy said with a grin. She pulled him up and they went over to see the scores. Ace felt annoyed. Why didn't Luffy help him up when he fell? Why didn't Luffy treat hiated Sabo? Ace grumbled. Suddenly, like someone had hit its brake, Ace's train of thoughts stopped. Why would he be annoyed by something like that? He didn't usually get irritated by that, right? Usually it's more about his father and his birth or something that he would get this disrupted. Why would he be feeling like this now? He waved a hand in the air as if trying to shoo away the thought, like he was trying to keep a fly away. He followed the too excited figure to the scoreboard and leaned closer. So how is it? It's a tie. All of us have 47 points. Sabo frowned. Luffy was rather disappointed. They decided the loser would have to hunt, but if there is no loser, then who would hunt? The coal-haired girl thought for a moment. She realized she liked thinking more after her adventures in her last life, then jumped up. She turned to Ace, making his cheeks reddened, then to Sabo. I have an idea. What is it? Ace turned away to hide his blush, his voice suddenly angry. Luffy ignored his angry tone and continued. How about this? We all go our separate ways in the jungle, and by the end of the afternoon, the one to return here with the biggest prey is the winner. The smallest prey will have to supply the food for tomorrow? Sabo caressed his imaginary goatee for a moment before nodding in agreement. Sure. We all return here by 5. Okay. They nodded in agreement before heading in different directions. And just as promised, by 5 p.m., the three siblings had returned with their prey covered by layers of cloth for the element of surprise. They lay the three beasts down and counted, 3, 2, 1, and they all pulled of the cloak. 3 gigantic crocodiles lay silently in the dirt, each wrapped up neatly in vines. The children looked at each other for a second, then suddenly burst out laughing. Oh my god. I can't believe we all caught the same thing, Sabo said as he wiped an artificial tear of his eye. He was laughing so hard he could barely speak. They're even the same size, Luffy pointed out while lying on the ground, giggling loudly. Ace was laughing too, but he didn't comment. Sometimes, he would direct his glance over to Luffy and unconsciously smile. The three troublemakers hauled their dinner home with pride and nearly shocked Dogra, Magra and Daden to death. It was known that it's best not to mess with the crocodiles, tigers and bears of Mount Corvo, and look what these three monsters did. Daden spent the rest of the day skinning the crocodiles and slicing up their flesh. She announced that they have gathered enough food for the next week, so they no longer need to hunt for food. Running out of things to do, the three were absolutely bored. They tried to play tag, hide and seek, card games and train, but they still ended up with time to spare. "I'm bored," Luffy whined. She was lying with her chest against the ground, her limbs stretched out and her cheeks presses against the grassy field. Ace sat crossed-legged next to her, his hands still fumbling with his broken pipe which was cut by Porkamy. "Deal with it, we all are. Maybe we should go into the jungle and explore a little bit," Sabo said as he ruffled through Luffy's messy hair. The young girl's head shot up. "Can we?" Ace reached over with his pipe and hit Luffy on the head. "No, we can't. It's the most dangerous time of the year to mess with the Tiger Lord. If only we have something to sell, we could just visit the town and sell some stuff," Sabo said as he settled down next to Luffy. He hadn't realized it himself, but he was quite fond of the girl and saw her as something near a sister. "Yeah, then we'll have something to do and also get money for our fund," Ace nodded in agreement. Luffy lay still for a moment, then suddenly jumped up. "I got it, we could sell the crocodile skin." Sabo thought for a minute before nodding and standing up with Luffy. "Yeah, that would work." He ruffled the coal-black strands and said with a grin, "Sometimes you just come up with the nicest ideas, Lou." "Hee hee, thanks," Luffy said as she grinned back. Ace stood up, though he felt slightly unsettled by the scene. He didn't know why. He still smiled and approached his two best friends. "I'm sure Daden is having the same idea as us, so let's smuggle some of those crocodile skin, shall we?" The great gates, the tall wall stretched to the sky, and in front of the gates that separates the most beautiful kingdom in the world and its trash, lines of people were traveling into the city. The dirty men stumbled in from the trash heaps and headed to the edge town, each carrying merchandises of many kinds. A certain man wearing an old cape with a hood covering his face, staggering like he had a broken leg, came forward, with a makeshift trolley in his hand. A piece of stained blue-gray cloth covered the object he carried, giving him a suspicious aura. The guard raised an arm and stopped the man in his tracks. He inquired, "Hey, wait, what are you carrying there?" He rifle held tight in his hands. "Crocodile skin, I am going to sell it." The man spoke, voice deep and raspy. He reached down and reveals the snout of a crocodile, making the guard jolt back. "Move along," he permitted, his voice slightly frightened. The man simply staggered forward, venturing deeper into the edge town, or as they say, the lawless town. This is where the hoodlums and outlaws of the kingdom gather. Ignoring the gazes of the delinquents, the weapons they held gleaming in their hands, the man walked forward. A hoodlum, probably the leader of the group surrounding that particular alleyway, approached the man with a staff in his hands. He held it over shoulders and said with ignorance in his voice, "Hey, old man. Why don't you just leave that package of yours here?" He snickered aloud. The underlings laughed along with the man and they began to gang upon the hooded figure. "Oi!" the ignorant hoodlum called aloud. Seeing as the man gave no reaction, "Say something already." "Shut up, you pathetic hoodlum," the man said with a voice that seemed unfit for his figure. The delinquent stepped back, an annoyed look on his face. "What?" But before he could react, the cape fluttered, revealing a hand where his legs should have been. And using the long iron pipe in its grip, the hand knocked the stranger down. "This guy's," he grumbled in surprised, his underling also draped with the same shocked look. "If you're going to rob someone," the man spoke as he reached for his cape. With a wave of the arm, the clothing was sent flying, revealing three young children sitting on top of one another, each of them with the same smug grin on their faces. Ace, the person on top, finished his declaration, "You should choose your victims more carefully." The men backed up in precaution and tightened the grip on their weapons. "It's the group from the other day," one on them shouted. Before any of the men could react, the children pounced up and charged into battle. In their disguise once again, the three little monsters wandered deeper into the city. They had now approached the high town, where all the royalty and nobles lived. This town was rumored to be the most beautiful town in East Blue, and at first look the statement would be correct. The people were all dressed in the most glamorous clothes, each of them wearing a smile. The buildings shined and sparkled as if they were made of gold and silver. The streets were cleaned and organized, and it felt as if there was not even a speck of dirt in the air. The hooded figure walked past countless people who all stopped in their tracks. Upon closer inspections, you could make out the ugliness in their look. How their faces contorted in disgust as they look upon the man carrying the trolley. "I'm glad we got so much money for the crocodile skin," Sabo said in an excited whisper, ignoring the people giving them their horrid looks. "Now, we've got even more for the pirate fund." "That's great," Luffy said with a smile, but then she frowned again, "but I'm hungry." "Hang in there just a little bit longer," Ace said as he looked down at his brothers. He was still as the torso and Luffy was the legs. The young girl had been whining for a while now about how heavy they were. "You'll get to eat a lot of delicious ramen after this." "Ramen?" Luffy asked, feigning ignorance. "Was it? Is it good?" Sabo inquired, interested too. Luffy stuck out her tongue and began to drool. Anything would be good to eat right now. Ace sighed. "We're almost there." They stopped at their tracks, the citizens avoiding them by all means. A sign in velvet red with the golden words, "Fine Dining. 8 Cairo," Chinese lanterns decorated its side. The green building stretched high and Ace couldn't help but let out a grin. They stepped inside and were greeted by a smug-looking waiter. "Welcome." He stopped mid-track, cold sweat break out under his skin. He waved his hands in the air and charged forward. Wait a minute. "This restaurant doesn't serve your kind," he said in a disgusting tone. Sabo jumbled through his jackets, searching through his pockets, and took out a golden locket. It glimmered under the light like a cat's eye. The daisy flower embedded on it sparkled in authority. The man was taken aback by the object and he was silenced. "I would like a private room, please," he faked his voice. "That crest," he managed to mutter before backing away with an abashed look. "Such an honor, a noble coming to our humble restaurant. We will prepare you a room immediately." His voice sickeningly sweet. The hooded figure stood still and tucked the crest back into the pocket. Ace mumbled to Sabo, "That's a handy thing you've got there." Yeah, I picked it up in town earlier," Sabo replied hesitantly. "Lie." Luffy thought to herself, but she kept quiet. It was not the time to mention it yet. She ducked her head down as she felt cold sweat falling from Sabo's chin. He was nervous. They were later greeted by a clumsy maid who led them to a VIP room and served them 3 bowls of ramen. She bowed down humbly about 3 times before exiting the room while saying, "Take your time and enjoy." "So this is ramen?" Sabo poked out from under the cloak. Luffy appeared too, her head nodding happily. It smelled so delicious and tempting, though it was not as good as his cruise chef's cooking. Ace pulled off the cape and said, a grin spreading across his face, "Well, try eating him." The 3 slurped down the noodles like soup and finished the 3 portions in a matter of seconds. They called for another 3 bowls of ramen and finished it immediately too. The order kept coming and coming and the bowls were stacking higher and higher. The chefs were freaking out as they worked themselves to half-death while the maid was fighting with a battle of stamina. By this time, one who did not realize that this man had something suspicious. They must be blinded by many things. Only until the moment Luffy accidentally stretched her hand out to grab the ramen order from the maid did she realize something was wrong. The men scurried upstairs towards the room where the children were. Hearing the frantic footsteps of the staffs, Luffy gulped down her noodles and pointed to the door. Ace and Sabo turned around, but it was too late. The manager had already entered the room with a scowl. "Customer, I was just told that." "Oh shit," Ace shouted. "We're busted," Sabo said as they took off the cloak. Luffy grabbed the last bowl and poured it down her throat as she grabbed her 2 brothers and they charged out the window. "Let's run." The 3 fell down from above with a rain of shattered glass, startling the people on the streets. The manager peeked out the broken window while shouting, "Catch them. They just ate without paying." The children fell from the building, ignoring the astonished looks on the people's faces. Luffy grabbed on a flag pole, spinning one round and landed on the ground with a back flip. Ace followed and Sabo fell on top of Luffy. "Sorry," he said with a shy smile. Of course, the young girl didn't mind. It didn't hurt anyways. She supported him to his feet and they started evading at top speed. "It's those 3 again," a snob-looking police officer said. "They are known criminals. Why'd you let them in?" "Someone, catch them, don't let them escape." The manager of the restaurant shouted for help in useless effort. No one had the mind to do it anyways. Why bother call for help? They only avoided the 3 children and let them escape the edge of the town. To think they'd escaped through the window, the maid said aghast, this is the 4th floor. TCH, and now they've costed us a window and 26 bowls of ramen. The manager sighed, his voice full of disappointment like a man he found an empty treasure chest. Manager, a note was left, it says, when I own One Piece, I'll pay you. By Luffy. One of the staff read aloud, crumbling the scrap paper in his hands. The 3 children ran across the street with stupid grins on their faces. It was a good day. They had gotten over their boredom, earned money for their fund and were allowed to try some new, tasty ramen. It was one of those days that Sabo loved. Sabo, a voice called aloud and the blond young boy could feel his happiness crumble to dust. He told himself to not turn around and continue running when the voice called out again, isn't that Sabo? Wait. Sabo couldn't help his reflexes. He stopped in his track and turned towards the voice that he dreaded. A man, in about his 50s, wearing a dark blue coat with a top hat similar to Sabo's except for the golden feathers attached to it. He was tall with greasy, curly black hair, a snobby face and a line of thin mustache over his lips. It was the face that Sabo hated the most in the world. You're still alive, he said as he approached the boy. Sabo shot him an annoyed look, ignoring him while his brothers began to surround him. Ace asked, eyeing him suspiciously. Hey, Sabo, he's calling for you. Do you know him? He's just mistaken. Let's go. Sabo shouted, more like to himself, and continued to run forward. Luffy had a worried look in her eyes but wiped it away before anyone could notice. They headed off into the jungle, leaving the man behind to his own distress. What? I'm not hiding anything, Sabo said at his 2 friends who continued to spy on him suspiciously. Cold sweat broke up on his skin and he could feel his palms clenched up. He flinched under the gazes but couldn't turn away. Spit it out, the 2 others said in unison. Ace declared angrily, it's not okay to keep secrets from each other, you know. Sabo was cornered. He didn't know what to do. He could tell them and allow himself to lose his 2 bestest friends or get beaten up by both Ace and Luffy. Pondering for a moment, he opened his only to close it the next millisecond. Let's try lying to them first, I'm telling you, I'm not. Before he could finish his sentence, his was immediately cut off by the 2 of them as they throttle him. Tell us, Ace shouted, fuming with anger. Okay, Sabo croaked as he clutched his neck. I'll tell you. They loosened the grip and Sabo leaned back against the tree bark. He said in a hesitant voice, he was a noble. Who? Ace and Luffy said in unison. The man calling to me, Sabo said, suddenly regretting telling it to the 2 of them. Okay, so, they said. I'm his son, Sabo said angrily. How could they be so similar while not being blood-related? Okay, so, again, the 2 spoke in sync. I'm a noble, Sabo shouted, his hand thrown into the air like he was praying to God. So, they said again while picking into their noses and Sabo blew his fuse. You're the one who asked me for this? The truth was I wasn't even a child from the Grey Terminal. I am not an orphan and both of my parents are alive. I lied to you, he said with a guilty look on his face. He stared down to his feet to avoid eye contact. I'm sorry. I'm shocked, Ace said as he turned his back toward his friend. A cold aura surrounded him. If you were a noble, why would you want to live here? Luffy kept silent. She already knew the answer and she was heartbroken. She laid a hand on his reassuringly. Sabo smiled at the gesture and continued. The reason why I ran away from was because my parents, they didn't see as a son. They saw me as a tool. They didn't love me. They loved the power, the money I could bring to them. We'd fight almost daily because I could never get high score in studies and they would even value a royal child over me. If I couldn't marry a royal girl, I'll just be trash to them. He felt like crying in his brain to stop but he couldn't. It's bad enough for you too, but even with parents, I was lonely. Luffy pulled Sabo into a warm, reassuring hug, subtly telling him to stop talking and that they understand. They stayed in that position for a moment before Sabo stood up and announced with a smile, Ace, Luffy, the 3 of us have to sail out to sea one day. We'll escape this country and we'll live as freely as possible. I will travel the world and write a book about my adventures. We'll get stronger and become pirates. He raised his hand in the air happily. The 2D siblings grinned brightly and Ace stood up, His chest puffed out with prideful, "I'll become a pirate anyways, and I will defeat everyone in my way and carve my name onto the world. All will know of me, and that will be the proof that I have lived," he announced, his head held high with a smile. Luffy couldn't help but smile too, seeing his brother so happy. Ace continued like challenging the world. "Even if the world hates me, even if the people loathe me, I'll be a great pirate and stand above everyone else. I will not run and win every fight. I will make people remember my name, even if it's through fear." "Hee hee, that's so." Luffy laughed happily as she ran up to the cliff's edge. She took in a deep breath and shouted, "Then I'll be the Pirate King." The waves crashed against the cliffside, shaking the earth underneath. Ace face palmed himself and Sabo began to laugh his head off. Soon he was joined in by Luffy. Sabo ruffled her hair. "You're interesting, Luffy. I'd like to see your future. Then join my crew." Luffy said happily, though she already knew the answer. "No way," the two brothers said in unison.